FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
Hey, you are listening to the Financial Survival Network. I'm Kerry Lutz, and today is October 1st, and we're trying a little something new here with John Rubino of dollarcollapse.com, our first time we're doing a video together here, John. And, well, hey, welcome. And like I said, it's October 1st. As always, be a part of the show. Email us. KL@kerrylutz.com. And John, hey.
Hey, Kerry.
It's not working exactly the way I want here, but we'll try to make it work on the Mevo. I have to learn how to do a fixed square around me and the screen, but we'll figure that out at some point. Anyway, John, so, hey, we're trying a little something new here. We're mixing it up. And welcome. So this is a first for us. I've been threatening to get into video, John, for years, but here we are. So, hey, a lot going on here in the world. We got a new agreement with Canada to extend NAFTA. We've got Chinese buckling under for the sanctions. We've got some listener questions that we might get to a little later, time permitting. Anyways, happy October 1st and happy Monday.
Hey, Kerry. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you.
Our very first video.
Yeah, it's wild. Well, hey, we're still experimenting, still doing it. I've got 2 recordings going here, so if one screws up, we've always got the other. Anyways, there's a lot to talk about here. Precious metals popped back up on Friday. Who knows why? And now they're down today. But anyway, check out John's work over at dollarcollapse.com. And so, John, what is the state of the world here?
Crazier than ever, it seems like. Although, you're right. The Canada-U.S. thing is nice to have off the plate. And it was always going to happen. This whole trade war thing is basically just a series of negotiations between us and other countries, and negotiations usually follow a kind of similar path where you make outrageous claims to begin with, you threaten to walk away from the table, people don't think the deal is going to get done, and then everybody at the end of the process settles in and cuts some kind of a deal. We did that with Canada.
Did it with
yesterday,
Mexico?
I guess, and we'll do it with China one of these days. So I don't think the whole trade war thing is the big issue that people think it is, just because nobody wants it to drag on for years. Everybody has a set of things they will compromise on when they're at whatever the deadline is. So that's going to happen, and we'll get an announcement in the next, hopefully, few weeks, but maybe a few months, where we cut some kind of a deal with China that works. Or at least is presented as something that works. And the financial markets will like that too. That doesn't fix anything though. See, it's really a sideshow.
Yeah.
All this trade war stuff, because the amount of debt that we're taking on is continuing to soar. And that's the real story, that we're all going broke at an accelerating rate. So it doesn't really matter what our terms of trade happen to be 5 years from now if we're all out of money or our money becomes worthless.
Hey, it's that old story. How did you go broke? And then you were the one that always quoted F. Scott Fitzgerald, slowly, then very quickly, right?
Well, that is how that works. You can drift along borrowing lots of money, and everything seems fine because nothing is really changing except that your debt levels are going up. But then at some point, that debt causes a crisis that leads everyone to actually start paying attention to the numbers, and then everything changes. Your creditors start taking away your stuff, basically, and that's the end of the game for you.
Yeah.
In fact, Bloomberg this morning just ran an article with the headline. I'm paraphrasing here, that the new Washington consensus is that deficits don't matter. because everybody's been getting away with running huge deficits for such a long time.
Yeah.
I think people forget that the original Reagan deficits, he's the first one who came up with this as a weapon.
Right.
And the idea was that if you cut taxes and the government runs a big deficit, that will force the Democrats to cut spending. In other words, they were talking about starving the beast back then.
Right.
And that was actually a tool for lowering government spending and shrinking the size of government. Mm-hmm. But what happened was nobody cared if we ran big deficits.
The Democrats don't care because they believe in financial alchemy. Yeah. They're Keynesians. They think that that deficits are wonderful and everyone should have one, right? Mm-hmm. Like a dog.
Yeah. Yeah, so we've been running big deficits for most of the subsequent 30 years since Reagan, and there's no political price to pay for doing that. So these guys have gotten the message that they can spend as much money as they want to. They don't have to worry about borrowing money because everybody wants dollars. They'll all lend us money, and because of that, our deficits now are on track to just accelerate from here. We're already going to run a $1 trillion deficit this year or next. Yeah. In the last year or the 10th year of a recovery. This is normally when countries have so much tax revenue coming in because everybody's working and asset prices are way up and everybody's generating capital gains that they either see their deficits shrink or they actually go into surplus. And we are running near record deficits right now. And that's a big change in global financial psychology. And it's one that is pretty consistent with human nature. We don't like to control ourselves. And we'll try to control ourselves for a while, but find out that the price for not controlling ourselves, at least initially, isn't that high. And so then we just let it all hang out. People do that with their weight. People do it with their personal finances, and countries do it with national finances. So we're in that part of the process right now where we think there's no cost to borrowing money. And we'll keep on doing that until the cost actually becomes apparent. There is a cost. Too much debt is disastrous for anybody at any level of any society. And what's happening with us is that we've got interest rates going up. Mm-hmm. At the same time, we've decided we can borrow as much as we want to, which means that our interest costs are going to explode at some point in the not too distant future. Which will totally blow out the budgets of governments and corporations and individuals. We're looking at 5% mortgages here pretty soon.
Yeah, we haven't seen them since the end of the financial collapse of 0809. After that, they just tended to stay under 5%, John, and that's the death knell for housing at some point, although there are a lot of cash buyers and investors out there in the real estate market, but still the mortgage market bounced back, and the mortgage market only exists because the Federal Reserve is buying mortgage-backed securities, although they're buying less than they were previously.
Well, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are basically government organizations that also buy mortgages.
Yeah.
So at every level of the mortgage market, the government is intervening to make 30-year mortgages available when the free market would not make them available. So that's a longer story, but it's basically one of the problems that we have in the financial system. We're enabling people who shouldn't be borrowing to borrow. And in the housing market, a lot of people, just based on their finances, not their character and not what they deserve out of life, but just based on their finances, shouldn't be getting a 30-year mortgage because they don't have enough money for a down payment, or their income isn't high enough or steady enough to make it likely that they'll be able to cover 30 years of payments. And yet we make it possible for them to buy houses because we think homeownership is a good public policy goal. But in reality, saddling somebody with a loan that they can't pay back and that's going to ruin their life as they try to, scrape enough money to pay it back and shortchange every other aspect of their lives, that's not a good thing. We didn't do them a favor. And that's one part of the debt story. Student loans is another part where we're lending people insane amounts of money to get college degrees that may or may not be valuable. And in a lot of cases, definitely are not valuable. corporations. We cut interest rates to unnaturally low levels, which encourage corporations to borrow money and use that money to buy back their stock at record high prices. So none of these guys are going to look back on this stage of their lives and think, oh, the government did us a favor by helping us borrow all that money. They're going to look back on it and think, oh my God, in a normal world, I never would have done that. And that wasn't a normal world. I know that now, but I didn't see it then. And so all of this stuff is coming. And now that we've got governments of the world deciding that they can borrow with impunity, there's no political cost, there's no financial cost, so they're just going to go for it and just relax and borrow whatever they want. That might be the last brick in that wall. It might be the last thing that has to happen before the system really starts to spin out of control. And that's just the U.S. We've got the same thing happening in Europe, where Italy, with their new government, decided to run a deficit that was higher than the European Union is telling them they should be able to run. And they just said, no, we're a populist government. We're going to help common people with lots of new government spending. And so Italy kind of called Europe's bluff. And Europe, in turn, is calling Italy's bluff. The ECB isn't buying Italian bonds anymore. So Italian interest rates are spiking because they have to convince real people in the private sector to lend them money now when they run a deficit. And who in their right mind lends money for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years to Italy? And the answer is nobody at current interest rates. So
that's a great point.
Italy used to be able to borrow for less than the federal government. Now, the U.S. federal government. And now their interest costs are spiking above what the U.S. pays. Which means their budget is going to blow up. So a lot of this stuff has gone from being theoretical to actual cash flow issues. And that's going to change the nature of 2019, when all this stuff that, it's a moral issue, it's a theoretical issue, now it's a cash flow issue. And it is going to be a serious problem once these numbers become apparent to everybody.
I couldn't agree with you more. Hey, we could just summarize this easily, is that even when you think the government's doing you a favor, in the long run, it really isn't doing you any favor. It's hurting you. It's not helping you. And beware of governments bearing gifts, right?
What's that old saying? I'm from the government and I'm here to help you.
Right.
That everybody knows is a fantasy. But when they help you borrow money, that's a good sign that you probably shouldn't borrow that money, because the private sector, where people actually have to be paid back, if those guys won't lend you the money, then you shouldn't be borrowing the money. You should be using what you would have put towards interest to save. Now, of course, the government made it incredibly hard to save for the last 10 years, too, because they lowered interest rates to the point where, go ahead and put away the money, but you don't earn anything on it. So it just sits there. So why not use it for something? Which is why our savings rate in the U.S. is really low. It just goes on. And it can be all traced back to financial manipulation on the part of the government that is distorting the normal price signaling mechanism in the private sector. We've made it easier to borrow and harder to save for really going on 30 years now, because we began this whole interest rates at unnaturally low levels and bail out everybody in sight thing in the 1990s. So it goes all the way back to Alan Greenspan.
Totally. Hey, well, the late great economist and financial writer Harry Browne, he called the government's function the accommodating loser. It's like, hey, you want to hold up your nation's currency and keep it up higher? Just go and intervene in foreign exchange, which happened a lot in the past, not as much anymore that we know of. And then the government just loses money by buying up their currency, artificially creating demand. Like if the Fed went in and bought dollars on the FX to raise the value of the dollar, they'd be losing money on all those trades. And guys like George Soros have really made a total freaking fortune taking advantage of government interventions in the market.
Yeah. Well, the question now is, where are those guys with regard to the major currencies of the world? You would think that somebody like George Soros, or dozens and dozens of people like George Soros, would be looking at the world's fiat currencies and saying, okay, it's time to short these things. These things have to be devalued on a massive scale because the numbers don't work anymore. Right. So I think that time is coming. There will be some big fortunes made shorting the major fiat currencies. But the question is, which one goes first? And that might be the thing that's holding everybody back, because you'd think the Japanese yen would be a classic short based on the amount of money that the Japanese government is borrowing. They're borrowing more as a percent of GDP than anybody else in the world. But the Japanese yen exists in a world of other crappy currencies. So if you're going to use one currency to short another currency, it's really tricky to figure out which one you want to be long and which one you want to be short, because they're all being mismanaged down to their intrinsic value of zero at some point, but they're valued versus each other in the world, which might explain why real stuff is what's going up right now. You know, classic art and or fine art and trophy real estate and multinational corporate stocks are the things that are going up in value relative to these currencies. So, you know, in a sense, if you buy a London penthouse or you buy a Van Gogh, you're shorting dollars if you use dollars to buy them, because you're giving those dollars up in order to get these real things. And you expect those real things to go up relative to the dollar going forward. So we're seeing that already. Right. But we aren't seeing it in the foreign exchange market. And I think the reason for that is we don't know who's going to go first. And it could be anybody, because it'll probably be because of some external shock. Yeah, which is kind of I would say Europe, though. Yeah, you think Europe? Well, I think the Italy thing is interesting, because that's the second biggest or the third biggest country in the Eurozone, and it's the biggest debtor in the Eurozone. And they're not playing the game anymore. You know, they're not accepting the monetary regime that Germany has decreed. In other words, they're not accepting a strong currency because they can't function with a strong currency. So they're going to be really interesting to watch, because they seem to have decided that they're just going to borrow as much as they want to. And the ECB is, as I said, not buying their bonds anymore, so their interest rates are going up. So they could blow up very easily. Like let their interest rates go up a little bit from here, and their interest costs will break their budget. In other words, it'll force them to borrow even more money, to the point that they enter a kind of death spiral where their interest costs go up, forcing them to borrow more money, which makes their interest costs go up even more. And then you've got one of the biggest countries in this currency union blowing up on you. Yeah. And what does that do to the currency union? They either allow Italy to leave and go back to the lira, or they bail them out. And when they bail out the biggest debtor in the system, then everybody else is going to line up for that same deal. You know, Spain's going to want that deal, and Portugal and Greece, and then the system starts to break down. So I think it's completely possible in the next few years that Europe goes through something like that, and then that currency, the euro, becomes the first sick major currency that really starts falling versus these other ones. Yeah, you could very well be right, John. I mean, you know, it's been so mismanaged for decades, and it keeps getting worse. There's nothing getting better. So yeah, you have these little minor blips up in GDP, but that isn't really the proper barometer of the health of the international monetary system, is it? Well, no, these headline numbers look good, but as with anything else, when you buy something, you look at the thing you bought and then the price you had to pay, right? Mm-hmm. And you only know if you got a good deal if the price was low enough to make it a good deal. What we're having to pay in terms of debt, in other words, how much we have to borrow to get each new unit of GDP or each decrease in unemployment, is exorbitant. And it used to be that if you borrowed some money, like in the 1960s, for instance, if you borrowed money and invested it in the U.S., you got about a one-to-one relationship, or one-to-one return. In other words, you borrow $1, you get a new $1 of GDP. Now it's 6 or 7. We have to borrow $6 or $7 to get a new unit of GDP. And GDP itself is becoming a debased measurement of actual wealth creation, because a lot of it is healthcare, which is just maintenance. It's not wealth creation at all in the GDP. So our ability to create new wealth and to cover our debt is diminishing as our debt rises. And again, it works the same way for a country as it does for an individual. If your debts are rising relative to your income, there's a breaking point out there, right? And that point is when you can't cover your interest costs anymore, and then you default on something and they take all your stuff away. Countries have that same problem with debt. And based on history, we're in that territory now. Our debts, wherever you look, whatever society, other than Russia, which is handling its debts pretty well. But everybody else, their debts are at record levels. Their ability to use new debt to create new wealth is diminishing. So we're in the territory within which defaults start happening and death spirals start to take place and the financial markets start to freak out. That doesn't mean it happens this year or next year, but it means we've created the conditions for it to happen. And if we continue along this path, which we are, nobody's changing course right now. No. Eventually, this blows up on us. We just don't know exactly when.
Yeah, we don't hate to be a broken record out there, guys, but we don't know when. Hey, John, well, we tried this experiment. I'm not sure how successful it's going to be. I won't know till I download the video. But anyways, find John over at dollarcollapse.com. We're at Financial Survival Network. You're watching on YouTube, just click the subscribe and the bell. Otherwise, the Twitter feed's at Kerry Lutz, the Facebook page, Financial Survival Network. Don't forget, we published the 11 medical hacks that can save you tens of thousands of dollars. It saved me over $50,000 over the past 4 years. So I highly recommend it. Just send us an email, kl@kerrylutz.com. We'll send you the link to the hacks. John, we'll do this next week, and hopefully I will be a more adept camera person or cameraman, as we used to say, right?
Okay. Talk to you next week, Eric.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.